I'm a U.S. Senator. Immunity protects me. This tape is illegal. Dismiss it, or Washington will bury this court.
You won't believe what happened the day a sitting United States senator tried to lecture a judge on the limits of judicial power and ended up facing the limits of his own immunity. In my years on the bench, I have seen tears, lies, apologies, and miracles. I have seen the highest of the high and the lowest of the low. But nothing prepared me for that sharp, overcast morning in November, when Senator Marcus Thorne walked into my courtroom wearing a $5,000 charcoal suit, carrying himself as if the very marble floors had been paid for by his campaign donors. The courtroom was packed before I even stepped in at 8:45 a.m. I walked in with my morning coffee in one hand and my father's old, weathered leather folder in the other. That folder was a gift from a man who spent 40 years working on a cold factory floor, a man who taught me that the law is the only thing that keeps the powerful from trampling the weak. As I took my seat, that folder sat on the bench as a silent reminder. In this room, no title is more important than the truth. My clerk, Sandra, leaned in and whispered, "Case 88214, Judge. It's going to be a long morning." I looked down at the docket. Senator Marcus Thorne, age 58. Charges, obstruction of justice, and felony witness tampering. To anyone else, these were serious charges, but to Thorne, they seemed like a minor inconvenience. He stood tall, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his silk tie reflecting the overhead lights, and a gold Patek Philippe watch gleaming on his wrist, a constant, ticking reminder that he believed time and authority belonged to him alone. Beside him stood his lead counsel, Julian Vane, the kind of high-priced attorney you hire when you believe that consequences are purely optional for the elite. Across the aisle was Assistant District Attorney Sarah Jenkins. She was young and sharp, but I could see her hands trembling slightly as she organized her files. That was my first clue that this case was far deeper and more dangerous than the simple charges suggested on the paper. I struck the gavel, the sound echoing through the sudden silence of the room. And as I looked at the senator, I knew that power had walked into my courtroom thinking it owned the law, but it was about to find out that the law has a way of fighting back. The silence in the room was heavy, the kind of silence that usually precedes a storm. As Sarah Jenkins began to speak, her voice lost its tremor and turned to steel, laying out a timeline that made the air in the room feel cold. She told the court about a rain-slicked highway 4 weeks ago and a young father named David Miller. David was a local high school teacher, a man who volunteered at the community center and was driving home from a late-night parent-teacher conference to see his newborn daughter. On that same highway was Leo Thorne, the senator's 4-year-old son, behind the wheel of a custom-built Italian sports car that cost more than David Miller would earn in a decade. Leo, boasting about his speed on a live stream, had clipped David's sedan, sending it spiraling into a concrete barrier. David was left pinned in the wreckage with a shattered hip and a collapsed lung. While Leo didn't even tap his brakes, he just kept driving. It should have been a clear-cut case of hit and run, a young man held accountable for a moment of reckless arrogance. But then, the machine of power began to turn. Sarah Jenkins presented evidence that Senator Thorne didn't just call a lawyer for his son. He arrived at the police precinct at 2 a.m. before the accident report was even filed. He didn't come to check on the victim. He came to ensure the narrative was erased. He stood in the captain's office and demanded that the dashcam footage from the responding units be lost during the transfer to the digital server. He threatened the lead investigator's pension, promising that if Leo's name appeared on any formal charge, the investigator would find himself patrolling the furthest outskirts of the county by Monday morning. As these details filled the courtroom, I watched Senator Thorne. He wasn't flinching. He sat there with that same smug, practiced smile, his gold Patek Philippe watch catching the light every time he adjusted his cufflinks. He looked bored, as if listening to the destruction of a man's life was an administrative chore that was beneath his station. He leaned over and whispered something to Julian Vane, and they both chuckled softly, a sound that made my blood boil beneath my robe. He truly believed that his status made him a ghost in the eyes of the law, someone who could walk through walls while everyone else was forced to use the door. But as I looked at the files Sandra had prepared, I knew that the senator's shadow was about to be overtaken by a much brighter light. What happened next would become one of the most talked about moments in our city's legal history. The moment when the untouchable senator realized that digital footprints don't care about political rank. Julian Vane stood up, his voice oily and confident, arguing that the prosecution's case was built on hearsay and administrative misunderstandings. He moved to dismiss the charges, claiming that as a senator, Thorne possessed a level of legislative immunity that shielded him from what he called this petty judicial theater. Thorne nodded along, looking at the ceiling as if counting the minutes until his lunch reservation. But Sarah Jenkins didn't flinch. She looked directly at me and said, "Your Honor, the people would like to enter Exhibit C into the record." She didn't hold up a paper or a folder. She held up a small, silver thumb drive. The senator's smug smile twitched just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for me to see the first crack in his marble facade. "This recording," Sarah began, her voice echoing in the rafters, "was not captured by a police wire or a sanctioned tap. It was captured by a voice-activated recorder in the investigator's own pocket, a man who knew that a senator's request was actually a death sentence for his career." She pressed play. The courtroom speakers crackled for a moment, and then Thorne's voice filled the room, but it wasn't the polished, statesman-like voice people heard on the evening news. It was cold, jagged, and dripping with a terrifying level of entitlement. "You listen to me," the recording blared. "Leo is a Thorne. He doesn't go to jail. He doesn't even get a ticket. You make that dashcam footage disappear, or I will make sure your children are attending a new school district in the poorest part of the state by Christmas. Do you understand the weight of the man you're talking to?" The room was stunned into a silence so deep you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Thorne's face drained of its color, turning a sickly shade of gray as his own arrogance echoed back at him from the walls of the courtroom. This wasn't a ruling. It was emotional relief for every person in that gallery who had ever been stepped on by a giant. I leaned forward, letting the silence hang until it became a physical weight, and I asked the senator if he recognized the man speaking on that tape. He didn't answer. He just tightened his grip on the mahogany table until his knuckles turned white. The silence in the courtroom did not last long. Arrogance has a way of regenerating itself, like a weed rooted deep in the soil of power. Senator Thorne took a deep breath, adjusted his silk tie, and stood up. This time, the half-smirk of pure contempt had returned to his face. He looked at Sarah Jenkins as if she were merely a speck of dust on his polished Italian leather shoes, then turned to look directly at me with a gaze that was nothing short of a challenge. "Judge Boyd," Thorne began, his voice now filled with the practiced, statesman-like resonance he had honed over decades on the political stage. "We've had a very entertaining morning of theater, but let me remind you, and this young ADA, of reality. I am a United States Senator. I am protected by constitutional immunities that this small-town office has no jurisdiction to violate." He slammed his hand down on the mahogany table, the sound a sharp crack that echoed through the room. "This so-called evidence is a product of illegal surveillance, a desperate attempt to smear a public servant who has dedicated his life to this country. My immunity is not a suggestion, it is a steel shield." Julian Vane, his lawyer, quickly stood up to bolster the attack, beginning to drone on with complex legal citations regarding the speech or debate clause and legislative privilege, attempting to turn blatant criminal corruption into a dry matter of procedural law. My blood boiled again. I looked down at my father's old leather folder resting on the bench. I thought of my father's cracked, calloused hands, the hands that built this country without ever asking for a single favor or a shortcut before the law. I let Vane speak until he ran out of breath, and then I slowly leaned forward. "Senator," I said, my voice low and calm, but carrying the weight of 10 years of experience facing men who thought they were giants. "Immunity was designed to protect your legislative acts, not to provide a bunker for criminal acts committed to cover for your family." Thorne tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand, and the sheer authority of the black robe seemed to freeze him in place. "You may believe you are an untouchable titan, but the law does not see titles, it only sees behavior. And the behavior on that tape isn't politics. It's extortion." Thorne's jaw tightened, the muscles in his face twitching, and I knew that this defiance was only the preamble to the dramatic twist I was holding in my hands. Just as Julian Vane was about to sit down, looking triumphant as if he had already won the procedural battle of the century. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a thud that echoed like a heartbeat. Every head in the gallery turned at once. Walking down the center aisle was not another high-priced lawyer or a political staffer. It was Marcus Sterling, the senator's own chief of staff, and his closest confidant for over 15 years. Thorne's eyes went wide, his grip on his mahogany table tightening so hard I thought the wood might snap. Julian Vane tried to jump in, shouting about unauthorized witnesses and violation of protocol, but the air in the room had already shifted. Sterling didn't look at the cameras, and he didn't look at the senator. He walked straight to the prosecutor's table and handed Sarah Jenkins a thick, blue, expanding folder. "Your Honor," Sterling said, his voice raspy but clear, "I've spent 15 years keeping the senator's secrets. I'm not spending the next 15 in a federal cell for him." The courtroom buzzed with a sound like a hornet's nest being kicked. Sarah Jenkins began pulling documents from the folder, not just emails, but Thorne's private journals and a VIP ledger that detailed every bribe, every altered police report, and every witness who had been silenced over the last decade. It was a systematic blueprint of how power had been used to bypass the very laws Thorne was sworn to uphold. This wasn't just about a hit and run anymore. This was about a criminal empire operating out of a Senate office. Thorne snapped. His practiced, statesman-like mask finally disintegrated, revealing a man consumed by a terrifying, desperate rage. He stood up, his face turning a dark, bruised shade of purple, and pointed a trembling finger directly at me. "Judge Boyd," he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You are out of your depth. You have no authority to look at those papers. I have friends in the Justice Department who will have your bench stripped and your life ruined before the sun sets." He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it, and began frantically dialing a number he believed still carried weight. He was a man drowning on dry land, still trying to order the tide to stop. Senator Thorne's face was a mask of desperation as he shouted into his phone, his voice cracking under the weight of his own crumbling empire. "Do you know who I am?" he roared, the veins in his neck bulging like ropes as he glared at Marcus Sterling. He was ordering an immediate federal intervention, demanding that my courtroom be cleared and that I be taken into custody for judicial overreach and national security violations. I didn't reach for my gavel. I didn't call for the bailiffs to restrain him. I simply sat there, watching the man who thought he was a god realize he was only a ghost. The courtroom was so still you could hear the frantic, shallow breathing of the senator's staff in the front row. We waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes. 5 minutes passed in a silence so heavy it felt like the walls were closing in. The heavy oak doors remained shut. No federal agents burst in to rescue the elite. No orders came down from the Justice Department to silence the truth. Thorne's hand began to shake as he slowly pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at the screen as if it had betrayed him. The person on the other end, the powerful contact he had spent decades cultivating with favors and funds, had simply hung up. Then came the final blow to his simulated authority. Sarah Jenkins' tablet chimed with a high-priority notification that echoed through the silence. She looked up, her face reflecting the cold light of the courtroom monitors, and addressed the bench with a voice that was no longer trembling. "Your Honor," she said, "the Senate Ethics Committee has just concluded an emergency session. By a unanimous vote, Senator Marcus Thorne has been stripped of all legislative immunity and suspended indefinitely, effective immediately." The air seemed to leave Thorne's lungs all at once. He sank back into his leather chair, the $5,000 suit now, looking several sizes too large for his shrinking frame. The gold Rolex on his wrist continued to tick, but it no longer signaled power. It signaled the countdown to his own accountability. He looked over at Marcus Sterling, the man who had protected him for 15 years, but Sterling looked away. The Titan had fallen, and in his place sat a man who finally realized that in this room, the only thing that is truly untouchable is the law itself. The moment the entire courtroom had been waiting for finally arrived, and it was a moment that would be etched into the memory of everyone present. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room opened for the final time, and 2 uniformed officers from the Capitol Police entered. These were men who had likely saluted Senator Thorne for years. But today, They weren't there to offer him a seat or a security detail. They walked with a purpose that silenced the remaining murmurs in the gallery, moving past the high-priced defense table without a glance at Julian Vane. They stood directly behind the man who, only minutes ago, had believed he was the most powerful person in the room. It was Officer Patricia Morales who stepped forward, the very officer whose career Thorne had threatened to burn to the ground in that recorded phone call. She looked him in the eyes with a calm, steady gaze that was more authoritative than any gavel I could strike. She didn't flinch, and she didn't show anger. She simply performed the duty he had tried to stop her from doing weeks ago. "Marcus Thorne," she said, her voice clear and echoing through the rafters, "you are under arrest for witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, and felony public corruption." Thorne didn't move at first. He looked at the silver handcuffs in her hand as if they were a mistake, an impossibility in his version of reality. He looked around the room for his friends, for the influence he had bragged about, but he found only the cold, hard stares of a public that was tired of being stepped on. Julian Vane started to stammer about illegal procedures and legislative privilege, but the officers ignored him. They pulled Thorne's hands behind his back, and the metal clicked into place with a sharp, final sound that signaled the absolute end of his era of immunity. The arrogance vanished from his face in a heartbeat. All that remained was a raw, naked panic as he realized that his $5,000 suit, his gold watch, and his decades of political favors were useless against the simple weight of the law. He stumbled as they led him away, his head down, no longer the titan of the Senate, but just another defendant facing the consequences of his choices. The courtroom held its collective breath, stunned into a silence of disbelief and profound relief. Justice wasn't just spoken today, it was felt. With Senator Thorne finally in handcuffs, I leaned back and addressed him directly, letting every word land with the weight of the 43 years of judicial experience I've carried since my father first handed me that leather folder. I looked at him, no longer seeing a titan of industry or a king of the Senate, but a man who had fundamentally betrayed the public trust he was sworn to protect. In all my years on this bench, I told him, I had never seen someone so brazen, so shameless, and so willing to treat the law like a personal suggestion rather than a mandate. I recounted every offense for the record: the orchestration of a hit-and-run cover-up, the malicious threats against Officer Morales, the systematic corruption detailed in Sterling's ledger, and the absolute abuse of power that had poisoned this city for a decade. The courtroom was dead silent, every eye fixed on the fallen senator as I pronounced the verdict. Guilty on all counts: criminal contempt of court, witness intimidation, and felony obstruction of justice. The sentence was absolute: 5 years in a federal facility, no bail, and immediate incarceration. But I went further because accountability must extend beyond mere punishment. Richardson was ordered to pay full restitution to David Miller, covering every cent of his medical bills and ensuring his daughter's leukemia treatment would be fully funded for years to come. He was required to issue a public apology to the entire police force he had tried to weaponize. And upon his release, he would complete 2,000 hours of community service at the very trauma center where David Miller had fought for his life, forcing the senator to see the human cost of the arrogance he had fostered. As the officers led him away, I saw something I had waited for all day, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He finally realized he was not special. He was not above the law. Money and position had failed him because simulated authority can never survive the light of truth. I turned to the courtroom and thanked Officer Morales for her courage, acknowledged Marcus Sterling for finally choosing the truth, and spoke to David Miller, who was now weeping in the front row. The lesson was clear: courage and integrity can restore justice even when the system feels broken. Power isn't something you wear, it's something you earn through service. And today, justice finally found its voice.